All right, well, today's webinar, we're going to be talking about data collection and analysis in community action. So I will review our agenda for today. Our objectives that we're going to go through, hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will have a basic understanding of data. What is it, how is it collected, and how is it reported? We're going to explore some simple analysis techniques, so some techniques that don't require having a statistician on staff at Community Action Agency, as we know that it often isn't possible. But these are simple analysis techniques that anyone can really engage in with their agencies. Also, we're going to identify what the board needs to know, as well as kind of what action steps board and staff can take. And then also we're going to consider some next steps. So things like policies and procedures. We're going to talk a little bit about measurement tools, creating reports, and things like that. So before we jump into talking about specific items around collection and analysis of data, we want to understand the basics about data. And so it's important that we kind of begin with this foundation. So what is data? Data can be described as facts or a set of well-defined distinct objects, such as numbers or responses, that can be used for some practical purpose. These could be facts, figures, characters, texts, pictures, sound, video. There's lots of different ways that data, can come across. But the thing is that, as we look at data all together, we can turn that into information and knowledge. So data is really facts that are observed, measured, collected, and aggregated, so in that raw form. And sometimes people think that data and information are interchangeable. However, there is a difference. And so although these are very closely related concepts, each has its own role in relation to each other, and each term has its own meaning. So information then comes from organizing, processing, and interpreting data so as to make the data meaningful or useful. So we then put data into context so that it means something, and data only becomes information for decision making once it's been analyzed in some fashion. Then knowledge is derived from the interaction of information and experience with a topic. So that's kind of where you bring in things like data, quantitative and qualitative data, and in that process of coming together and doing things like asking questions, layering data, all of those things we're going to talk about a little bit later to really determine and bring up some knowledge from this experience and information with the topic. So here's an example. The height of Mount Everest is one piece of data that we could pull. The height is 29,029 feet. The height can be recorded precisely with, an altimeter and then entered into a database. Other data elements that we could look at regarding Mount Everest are the location, such as the longitude and latitude on a map, the temperature, perhaps the range of temperatures in the area, and the identification of the terrain. And so this data may be included in a database or chart, maybe with other data about Mount Everest. Then the data elements that we have on Mount Everest are aggregated and compared in such a way that they provide some information about the mountain that would be useful to those who wish to make a decision about the best method to climb it. And so the information then comes from that combination of those data elements to really understand what the conditions are on the mountain to make that kind of informed decision. Then using this information, coupled with experience from climbing mountains in general or other specific mountains with different data characteristics, persons that might seek to reach Mount Everest peak may be seen as having knowledge about that subject. And all of that coming together can then set a person up for success to then climb that mountain. So data has four quality attributes that must be considered to make sure that our data is complete, that it's timely, reliable, and accurate. So it's important for us to have good data that we can turn into information and knowledge. And so these are sort of the 4 ways that we define good data. So going into more detail, complete data is all the required data that is collected. So this might be all demographic data that's collected during your intake process. So making sure there's no missing data elements from that intake. Then timely, data is collected and entered into a system at the time of encounter, or there's a formal schedule for collecting and entering that data so that, that it doesn't get old. Reliable, this is where we look at consistency or repeatability of what is being measured as it being verified. Then accurate, the data is entered as the actual true value. So making sure that what we're measuring is what we think we're measuring. Is it the actual value of the element being measured, not just an approximation or a sample. So making sure we're really getting to the actual true value. So then what if the data is flawed? So sometimes, we look at those data quality attributes and we think, oh gosh, sometimes it's, hard to get it in on time, or sometimes we don't have complete data because we're not able to, get the complete data from the client. And so it's important to note that if basic data is not accurate or complete, the information we derive from that data is then not accurate. And we can't make reliable judgments or develop reliable knowledge from the information. And that knowledge simply cannot become wisdom, since errors will appear as soon as it's tested. And so bad data can ultimately cost time and effort. It can give us false impressions. It can result in poor forecasting, poor targeting, and it can kind of devalue those decisions that end up following. And so we want to make sure that, if we set programs into motion based on faulty data, then we might have, entered into some poor decision making, and we don't want to suffer those consequences later. And so it's really important to attempt to get good data that's complete, timely, reliable, and accurate, if at all possible. And so some of this goes within our data policies and procedures, which we'll mention a little bit later as well. And so these errors that result in faulty data can happen along the way. They can happen when we collect data from the primary source. It can happen whenever we enter data into the storage apparatus. It can also happen whenever we retrieve and aggregate those data elements. It can happen during the analysis process when we turn data into information. And then it can happen also whenever we make judgments based on information. And so then it's also that domino effect through that cycle that can make it, as you can see, can make it worse on the other end. Okay, so this part, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Barbara Moody. She's going to be co-facilitating with me today, and she's going to talk a little bit about why do we collect data and the different reasons to assure complete, timely, and reliable and accurate data that's available in the agency. So Barbara, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. It's very important to know this basic information about data collection and to understand the quality of the data so we know what we're collecting and why we're collecting it. Collecting is the first step along the way to analysis of the data. Courtney, will you advance the slides for me? So I'm ready to go to the next one. Why are data elements collected? So very often the way we have looked at data collection in the past is that we are doing it for reporting. And it's actually very possible that an agency can be successful in just collecting and reporting data without analyzing the data. And actually, many in our network and many in other nonprofits have been doing this for years because there are really more informal ways to analyze the data that really happens naturally. The report itself may not provide for analysis, but we naturally do some of these other things. But it's important that we recognize and we articulate our need for data to manage the agency, to measure staff performance, and to really measure the impact or the results of what we're doing. And the other here really represents the continuous improvement that we expect that data will allow us to make. And we can make changes that will help us improve our results. Okay, next. We have to change our attitudes about this. So it's not just collecting data for reporting, but actually to manage and support the agency's programs. We want to know if we're making a difference, and that's the point of data analysis. So before you really start to analyze, you must know that you're collecting the right data. And so data has to be useful to you, so that you know you might need to collect some things for reporting, but there are other things that you need to collect just to be useful to your agency. So you might recognize these questions on the next page. How many clients are you serving? Who are they? What services do you give them? What's it cost? And then what happens to clients as a result of this service? So these are the kinds of questions that you want to have data to answer. Where do you get the data from? Where does the data come from? It comes from customers, and the way that it's collected from customers can be important in your accuracy for your data analysis later on. Is it paper that staff uses? Are there electronic tools? Are they intake forms, sign-in sheets? How are you collecting data from customers? It's about both the customers themselves and also the services that they receive. You're also going to be getting data elements from your other agency documents, from your strategic plan, from your fiscal office, from your annual report data, maybe from the logic models that you create for different agency programs, and from your community needs assessment. All of those are opportunities for you to look at data that's collected from agency documents. So once you have the data, then you want to know where the data goes. So where is it stored? Who gets to see the data? And who are the stakeholders in this data process? Here are a couple of ideas about data storage tools, things collected in spreadsheets or in databases, in cloud-based software. The way that you store your data is going to be important to you because your ability to analyze your data will be based on your storage capacity. So then who is going to do the analysis? You can't expect that people are going to be able to analyze data if they don't have access to it. So you want to consider, as you develop your data analysis procedures, which Courtney mentioned and we'll talk about a little more later, but you want to make sure that that people have access to the data so they can analyze it and they can make decisions about it. So we often leave off the direct service staff, the frontline workers, but really they have to be integral partners in this data collection, storage, and analysis process if everything is going to be accurate. They're the ones who usually enter the data, and it's important that they're able to look at the data so they see the value of it. So they pay more attention to their accuracy and completeness. Be sure to understand that different audiences will need different pieces of your data. Not everyone is going to be interested in all of the data elements or going to be able to analyze all of the elements. So you may give different access to your data based on what your analysis expectations are. So I'm going to ask Courtney to take over and talk a little bit about measurement.
All right, well, thank you, Barbara. So we're going to talk a little bit about measurement and considering the measurement tools that we use and the processes that are a part of data collection and analysis. So some of you that have had Roma training, these are the columns that are over at the far kind of right columns of your logic model as you look at it. And as we mentioned, incomplete or inaccurate data can lead us to faulty conclusions. But as we look at, measurement tools as well as reports, we can consider what we measured and if they were the right things. So that's kind of what we want to talk about here. So consider your measurement processes. So as we talk through this, kind of think about how you do this in your organization. What do we measure and then how do we measure it? And ideally, we're measuring several types of indicators. We might be measuring process indicators, and those provide evidence of whether the program unfolded according to plan. We might be looking at service delivery indicators that provide straightforward information about what a program is providing, how much, how many, how often. Those are the kind of questions we can answer with service delivery indicators. Then customer service or customer satisfaction indicators provide information about whether the program met the customer expectations. And this can identify agency level needs. Especially, we use this data in both community needs assessments and strategic planning as well. Then impact indicators provide evidence of whether the program has had impact that it was intended to have. So in other words, were the results what were the results or what were those outcomes? Then cost indicators provide some insight into the cost-benefit ratio of what we're doing. So kind of that return on investment idea. Then if we've measured these indicators, we'll want to reflect on then how did we do that? So if someone was looking for evidence of various indicators you have measured, then where would they find it? You might say that we have a database or we keep track using a scale or matrix. And these are ways to keep track, but what is the evidence itself? So you will need to identify measurement tools such as copies of rent receipts, pay stubs, or client reports that show success or progress. And you will need to consider, are we measuring the right things? Are we using the right measurement tools? Are we using the right, are the right people using the measures within the organization? And then we also want to consider how we've collected and stored data to guard against inaccuracies, corruption, or loss of data. So how often do you take measures of progress? So what's the frequency as well? If you're going to use data from your measures, you can't wait until the program is over at the end of the year. So if we believe movement out of poverty is complex and difficult, then long-term effort must be tracked, not only within a year, but also across multiple program years or reporting periods. So looking then at trend data and looking at both short-term and long-term impact of our work. And also, if it's hard to collect the data, it sometimes becomes hard to sell the meaningfulness of the process. And too much time is spent in the data collection, and there isn't enough time left to consider information produced and to use it to help staff ultimately really do their work better. Data collection, as we know, takes time, takes effort, takes money. So it is important to be strategic in the data collection processes and consider how we're measuring things and what we're measuring. So once we've collected this data and it's stored, it can be turned into reports. So we're going to talk here a little bit about creating reports. And we want to understand data that is required for reporting to a funding source. So like Barbara talked about earlier, that's not the only reason that we want to collect data, but we know that that's one of the reasons why we collect data. And so sometimes the source of funding gives you an outcome that you are to achieve with their funds and a target that you're expected to hit. So this might be a number to be served, a number to achieve the specific outcome. And this can be good news because it's easy to determine what you're expected to do. But it might be bad news if the imposed target is difficult to hit or if there are other outcomes that you want to track. So we want to kind of ask the question, how does this kind of reporting affect the whole agency reporting concept? And so, you know, as we know with CSBG funding, we often set our own targets, even though there's national performance indicators of what we can work towards. And so we want to, you know, ultimately, as we look at all these different funding sources that have different requirements, we want to see how all the services fit together to produce outcomes that move individuals, families, and communities toward those identified outcomes. And so, you know, this is where we're encouraging to have this whole agency approach, which will include those funder-imposed targets, targets that you set all together. So we also want to consider the quality of the reports that are generated at the agency. And this is really the way data is reported and how it can impact the usefulness of data. And so if the report is confusing to read, it can cause more questions than answers. And if there's too much data, essential elements could be missed. And then if the data isn't sorted well, then you might be flipping through pages to really find out what you want to know. So kind of considering it from the recipient's perspective, if whoever that recipient of the report might be, looking at it from that perspective to identify if it's confusing, if it has the essential elements, and if the data is sorted well. So these are some things to consider as we think about what type of data we include in the report, as well as the organization of the reports. And many agencies are starting to create scorecards or dashboards to help visualize data reporting. But whenever you start to condense data into that kind of format, we know that not everything is appropriate for this kind of presentation. But if it's done correctly, it can provide a very quick way to share information and analysis of raw data. So these 4 different items on the screen, we have our quality of data that's important to consider. So this is looking at, again, what we talked about, the accuracy, completeness, timeliness of the data that's included in the reports. Then also the presentation of the data in the report. So is it easy to read? Does it have visual elements? Can people find the data that they're looking for? What is the usefulness of the data? Is it relevant to the task of managing the program or service? And is there access to the data when people need or want it? And then also that performance focus. So kind of, again, circling back to Roma with this results orientation, are we including data on outcomes and performance as well as services and outputs? So another thing to consider is your audience. So who gets the reports? And so some people think about reports just as documents that have data generated by the programs, but they're also the means by which this kind of performance can be communicated, both within the agency as well as outside the agency. The boards of staff should then consider how reports can be used effectively to meet multiple purposes for the organization. And we want to be able to provide wide access to reports to enable to get more feedback from different places, from different audiences, because those observations about the data, the questions about the data that's raised, and the ideas for improving the data all can be very helpful and make analysis richer. So, you know, we often think about reports being sent to funders as required, but we want to consider all the angles of who gets the reports, who's viewing them, and where are we putting them. So it might be we're handing paper copies to agency staff, to board members, to funders, but also we're posting some of them on the website so external audiences can see these as well. And then also, what are those other ways that we can make sure we're getting the story out about community action in a good way of using our data as well. So just a few notes on board roles related to reporting. This actually touches on a few different organizational standards in Category 9, the data and analysis section. So standard 9.1 says that the organization or department has a system or systems in place to track and report client demographics and services that customers receive. Standard 9.2 says that the organization or department has a system in place to track family, agency, or community outcomes. And then 9.4 says that we have to submit annual CSBG annual report data, and it needs to reflect client demographics and CSBG funded outcomes. And so we want to make sure that we have that system in place to track each of these pieces of data to meet the organizational standards, but also to make sure that we are improving services, analyzing our data, and meeting all the requirements all in one. So board has a specific role to a lot of these. They're supposed to review programmatic reports on a regular basis and assure that these type of things are happening so that the organization remains in compliance. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara now. She's going to talk about analysis.
Thanks, Courtney. And I think in the recent survey about how well agencies across the country are meeting their organizational standards, this idea of what the board's role is in the analysis of data comes up. And so the board really has to have good reports, as Courtney described, so that they can move into this concept of turning the data into information for decision making, because the boards are ultimately responsible for decision making. And so what's the purpose of data analysis? It's really to extract meaningful insights. It's about insights that you gather from the data that is designed to improve agency performance. And remember that when we talk about agency performance being improved, it's because we want to have improved outcomes for families and communities. So we're using this analysis of data to get some meaningful insights that will provide actionable recommendations. So when we talk about this process, it's to what can we do? What are the recommendations that we're going to provide to the board that is going to make them have the decision-making power to be able to move forward? So sometimes in this analysis process, you find that there are simple questions that have to do with something that's missing data elements, or something that doesn't make sense, and so it looks like there might be an error. So that kind of analysis to find out if it's complete and accurate really doesn't go very deep or wide. It's just about the answer to these basic questions and probably doesn't provide specific recommendations. But it's the other kind of analysis that's important to us. That's important to us. That kind of analysis is important. But more important is analysis that produces recommendations based on insight that's about improved performance and improved outcomes. And so this is more complex in nature and requires more time for the deep dive analysis. What are the pieces of decision making and our data analysis for decision making? I think we sometimes want to say that data analysis is way too sophisticated for the normal staff person or for the normal person, but it really is about some of these simple processes that humans do all the time in every area of their life. So it's about questioning things, examining things. It's about interpreting what you see. It's about comparing, confirming, and testing the data that you're provided with. So you gather the data, you collect it, you store it, you report it, and now you look at it, you think about it, and you do some of these simple tasks that have to do with understanding your data. And part of this is about answering questions that you have. The analysis of data is going to provide you with decision-making possibilities, but you have to have some questions to make decisions about in order for this process to be meaningful to you and your agency. So the first thing that you want to do is organize the data into meaningful categories so that you understand what you want to know. If you don't know what you want to know, then this whole process of data analysis is so open-ended that it doesn't, it's not useful. And so then you won't do it if it's not useful. But you want to know things like, why is this year different from last year? What are problems that we've seen? What questions have we heard from our funding source, our partners, or our customers, that or from our staff? What are questions that we've heard, and how do we know what this data tells us? So the big questions is, did we do what we thought we would do? So we have a strategic plan, and so did we actually do that? Did we do what we thought we would do? And can we do it again? You know, are we positioned to do it again, or did we meet our goals and our targets? But boy, it was just a coincidence that we did, and maybe we can't do it again. But we need to know some specifics, and here are just a few questions that you might have before you start to analyze your data. Things about recruiting and enrolling, the right number of people to allow you to have the number of outcomes that you projected. Is it the population that you thought you'd serve? Did something unexpected happen? You know, what about resources? Were there sufficient resources for the information, for the work that you had to do? I think there's some more questions on the next page. I mean, we can think of lots of questions, but this is really the basis of your analysis. You have to know what you want to know. So all of the data analysis techniques that we're going to talk about next have to be fit into your questions. Go ahead to the next one. One of the main things that you want to know is how close did you come to your projections. The relationship between what you actually did and what you thought you would do is really a good way to determine your agency's capacity and your understanding of your agency's work. So this whole targeting ability piece is very important. So that's one of the main things that you want to look at. So there really is a lot of concern in our network when we talk about data analysis that we don't have agency capacity to do it. We hear things like staff just don't have the skills, or the staff that we have that are devoted to providing quality services to our customers are really not the same. They don't have the same skills or the same orientation as folks that do data analysis or this kind of data thinking. But we really believe that there are some basic things that can be done by anyone to begin the analysis process. Of course, this is really based on the agency's commitment to focus on results. Once the agency has this commitment, to the concept of using data for improvement, then the next piece will help orient the staff and the board to really talk about what this means. And this foundation of good data that we already have talked about, that we've laid the foundation for here, has to be there. And then it must be useful. It must be able to answer some questions that you want to see that it answers. And then we're going to look at these few basic analysis techniques: aggregate, count, compare, and consider the trends. And we're going to talk about each of those. When we talk about aggregating data, it's important for us to understand that this is about bringing similar data elements together. And it can be a simple report of a simple function of your reports. So how many people of a certain age were served by your program? How many of a certain income level were served? These are just pulling together population characteristics. You could also pull together other kinds of indicators, economic indicators, family type indicators, and it's this idea of putting things together in buckets that's about aggregating data. Now, I'll caution you to understand that this is not integrating data. When we talk about integrating data, that's really different, and integrating data is a little more complex because it often is about integrating data from different kinds of data systems, different software systems. And this could be problematic because the data systems might include different kinds of basic data elements, different definitions, and so that can be a problem. It can also be challenging if you're trying to integrate different kinds of data elements, so the number of people who got different kinds of services and achieved a certain outcome. So you might have some additional skill development that's needed for this piece, and maybe some specific software that's needed. But so that you know, there's a difference between aggregation and integration. The second thing is just to count. And everybody can count how many were served, how many services were delivered, how much money was spent, and then how many people were successful. It's a simple matter of counting how many did something, how many responded in a certain way, and how many of a certain characteristic. And then once you have your count, then you're going to compare. And this is really an important piece of analysis, to be able to look at your data and compare things. And there are so many different kinds of comparisons that you can do that are not difficult, and that your staff can easily do if they have the access to the data. So you can compare last year's counts to this year's counts. What's different? You can compare your local data with national data. You can compare with other agencies. You can compare the outcomes with the needs. And an interesting piece, if you had a need for a certain domain work in a certain domain, did you actually meet needs with outcomes in that area? And so there are a couple of ideas about comparison on the next couple slides, just real quickly, that you can compare the client characteristics with service data. This is something that you have access to that sometimes people don't look at. So, you know, who are you serving? Are you serving individuals or families, or what was the age of the folks? Did they come to a specific facility or a location? So how does the demographics of your clients meet your service data? And then what about the outcome data? Did a certain percent of your population who achieve the outcomes all fit into a certain client group, a certain demographic, and who are you reaching? What's the characteristics of the people that are achieving outcomes? These are all questions that you have data to support. So they're questions that you can follow up with. And then after you do your comparison, the next piece is really to think about trends. So if you see your population, when you're comparing your population, you're seeing that there's a certain age, look around and look over time and say, is the population changing? We know nationally that the population is aging. And so what impact does that have on your services? What's happening in the environment? Are there more opportunities for employment, for recreation, for health care, for financial services? What's happening? Just looking at the trends that provides you with a short and a long-term perspective. And then you can ask the question, what's causing these trends? You might need to look at other data points to find out what might be causing this trend that I'm seeing. But if you don't look at the trend, you don't identify the trend, you won't know to ask the question about what's causing the trend. And so it's important to understand those questions, because sometimes insights about why you've reached certain outcomes can be seen by your frontline staff, and not necessarily by your supervisory group, because they're looking at something different. Okay, now we're going to put that analysis to work. We've aggregated, we've counted, we've compared, we've looked at the trends, and now we're going to move to putting the data to work. We're going to try to learn from our review. We're learning some things. It's not just did we or did we not meet our goals, but why? Why did we get these results? And how good did we do? How would we rate our performance? Are we doing a good job? And what can we learn from our results that we've gotten? Some agencies look at monthly outcome data. Some look at 3 or 6 month period to get a clearer picture of when or if the program is going to meet the goals. So these reviews can be done with your inside your program, with your board, or with a leadership team. But it's important that you look at your reviews in a way that help you to analyze what you've done and how well you've done it. Then you should be able to take action. The point of data analysis is to give you actionable information. You should be able to rely on effective analysis and interpretation of your data to make meaning of your data elements, and then to use the information. And this is the point of your analysis, to actually come up with actions that help you make decisions. Every day, in every decision of the operation of your agency, your decision should be supported by data, by the information from the data. For the board, the long-term strategic decisions have to be based on the analysis of facts. And this is really part of the board's role related to analysis of data. It specifically says in Organizational Standards 9.5 that the governing board reviews or takes action on the analysis of the agency's outcomes and operational or strategic program adjustments and improvements. So the agency is not only given reports, but also an analysis of the data. What does it mean that we achieved these outcomes? What does the board need to know about the operational or strategic program performance? And then the board should be presented with suggestions for adjustments and improvements, and it's those suggestions that they're to act on. So if the board is told these are how many people we got employment for, then the board needs to contextualize that. They need to understand the context in which the outcomes occurred, both operational and strategic program performance. And so they should be given some suggestions. Either we strengthen the work that we're doing, or in some cases it might be that we abandon the work that we're doing. If we helped 300 people get jobs, how did we help them get the jobs? And how successful were we at helping people keep those jobs? Do we know that? Do we have follow-up? Are there processes in place that include staff or consultant knowledge that can help us do this work? Okay, we're going to take action. One of the things that both Courtney and I have mentioned is this idea of a policy and procedures manual. It's really important for you to have things written down that allow you to be intentional about your data collection and analysis. It's not just some irregular thing that happens, or it's based on whether we have a staff person that's interested in data analysis or not, but it's about the agency functioning. It's about a routine part of the agency functioning. And so these are just a couple ideas of things that happen if you don't have policies and procedures. The data isn't collected or stored in a timely manner, and nobody is monitoring it. Or there's a lack of follow-up, and so we're under-reporting our outcomes. We're not able to say that we helped people achieve an outcome because we're not following up. Another thing that's not on the slide, but sometimes the agency doesn't have access to their own data, so they have a software system where they have to ask the vendor for reports, and so they're stuck in a way that they can't use their own data, and that creates a barrier to the analysis process. So how can we improve data analysis? So a couple of things that we can do is to include monitoring in our plan. Remember, we're talking about creating a plan for analysis. And so if you don't have the idea of monitoring your data analysis process, then that gets lost. You do your data collection, you do your reporting, you might do some analysis, but it's not systematic, and there's no systematic feedback. So you want to include a mention of how you're going to monitor your data analysis process. And then another thing that you can do is to include the concept of data collection and analysis in staff roles, so in staff job descriptions or in material that's given to staff that clearly identifies that the agency has expectations related to the staff time and efforts related to documenting their interactions and their outcomes. And this might include a need for staff training. So that might be part of what you have to do. So the idea here is that we expect that you'll review your programs and your plan, your services, and then you'll start with a plan. You'll create a plan that might take into account different funders, requirements, how can you organize your reports for them in a way that would be more useful to your agency-wide approach. Can you develop a data map that would show the flow of information to determine what kind of software application you even need at this point. And so the last thing I want to say is that this data process, this data analysis process, gives you the questions that you need for your next data collection process. So we're continuing the cycle. You're identified what things you might have missed in the past and what other data you might need to gather as you move on to your next assessment process. So it ties that together. So I'm going to turn this back over to Courtney for our wrap-up, some final ideas.
All right, thanks, Barbara. So just want to kind of summarize this into some different actions for the staff and board of the community action agencies. First we want to understand what data is collected for management and accountability related to agency programs. So that is one item that both staff and board can do. First thing, really, to understand even the difference between management and accountability, and also assure that data is reliable. Another thing that staff and board can do is assure that reports are easy to read and formatted in a way that's useful. To know this or not, simply asking and kind of putting yourself in that perspective of the audience or the recipient of the report, asking the board if reports are easy to read, if they're useful, and then also assuring that all reports are submitted accurate, timely, and completely. Then staff can help prepare and distribute reports from the programs on a regular basis. Board then reads and asks those questions of the reports. So even just reviewing the organizational standards, making sure that the organization is on track with how often reports should be submitted to the board, making sure that you're on track with how often reports are submitted to funders, and even seeing kind of, again, where those like points are that can help to streamline things and make sure that you're also looking at that agency-wide perspective as well. One organizational standard to mention in relation to this is that the governing board or advisory body should receive updates on progress for the goals of the strategic plan within the past 12 months. So at least yearly, but a lot of times what we recommend is that you definitely should be looking at your data more often than just once a year. And so although the organizational standard recommends that these go to the board on an annual basis and that this analysis has to be presented to the board on an annual basis in Category 9 as well, we definitely suggest that that's not the only time that the internal staff takes a look at that, because that collection of data should be happening along the way, and then this data should be looked at over time as well. So a few more here. We also assuring that there is a system for analysis of the data and a way to make meaning about what's working. So we want to potentially look at what are those policies and procedures that we have in place for data and analysis, as well as data collection. We want to assure that reports aggregate information in useful ways, compare projected indicators with actual indicators to find out what happened. Did we do what we thought we would do? But then to go beyond that and also ask that question of why, like Barbara mentioned earlier. So just kind of reviewing back and making sure that, that we are compiling data in a good way, and that if we're not doing these steps, then these are some steps that can be taken to start the analysis process within the organization. Then, of course, the next step would be to make decisions based on the analysis of data. So as the cycle is continuing, making sure that we're using assessment data to plan upon, that we're using is the evaluation piece of how implementation of services went, what is results we achieved, and what's the evaluation of how that went over the program year or however long that the agency is looking at, and then identifying what needs to be adjusted based on that. And then putting those decisions into action for the next time around as we're delivering services or working with the community, reviewing those decisions, reviewing what maybe has changed, and then considering what else we need to know. So again, what else we might need to know in the next community needs assessment process, or the next time that we analyze the data that can help to inform our decisions even more. So with that, we'll leave you with those action items. So we want to bring up some different resources. I see that we have potentially a question or two that has come in. So we can address those here in a few, and just want to encourage anyone who does have some questions, please send those in the chat box or the question and answer box, and we'll be happy to answer those. But some different resources, we have lots of different information on this topic that goes into further detail on data collection, data analysis, and these on your screen here are some of the places that you can find some of that information. So our Community Action Partnership website, you can go to our resource library. Once we send out these slides, you'll also be able to just simply click on this link, and it'll take you to the listing of data-related resources on our website. Community Action Academy is our online learning management system. We have different on-demand courses on data collection and analysis that are available. And then, of course, if your agency is interested in building capacity around Roma professionals in your organization that can help with some of this process, we have the Roma National Peer-to-Peer Training Project that Barbara helps lead up, and you can find out more information there. So here on your screen, you see our Roma Next Generation Training Series, and there's several different pieces that bring out the topic of data. So I'll show you where to find those further resources. Community Action Academy is one place you can find additional resources on this. So you'll see we have data collection, analysis, and use is one on-demand training course that we have available. There's videos, PowerPoint slides, as well as a facilitation manual and associated resources within that course. And then we have, of course, our other pieces of that Roma Next Generation Training Series in there as well. And then we're currently working on that last piece of this training series on implementation of Roma. We also have a Roma for Boards training series. So this training series gets much deeper into what board members need to know about Roma, not just about Roma in general, but about each piece of the Roma cycle. And so as you can see on your screen, we have an introduction to Roma for board members, and then we go through assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results or reporting, and evaluation and analysis of data. So there's a specific segment on analysis of data for board members. And then we have a segment on creating a local theory of change as well. So you can go to moodle.communityactionpartnership.com and go to our Roma training category to find both of those training series. And again, this includes videos that are about 20, 25 minutes each for each segment. Those can be used during board trainings or between board meetings. Board members are welcome to create accounts on Community Action Academy as well, and it's free. Then our Roma resource guide that we have on our communityactionpartnership.com website. If you go to communityactionpartnership.com, go under Programs and Initiatives, and then go to Organizational Standards Center of Excellence. We have several different resource guides at the bottom of that page, and so you'll see here on your screen what's included in our Roma resource guide. That's another way to access these materials and more on Roma. And just to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars, we actually have a kind of a double webinar Wednesday today at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be talking about the proposed changes to the official poverty measure. And then you can see many of our webinars coming up in June that focus on several different topics. We're going to talk about our tools and resources next Wednesday, give you a tour of where all those are located. We know there's lots out there, and sometimes they're can be a little bit hard to find, but we've tried to improve how it's organized recently. We're going to be talking about social enterprise on June 12th, history of community action on June 14th. We're going to be talking about continuous quality improvement on June 19th, and that's going to actually be a little bit of a continuation to today's webinar. So we're going to be building on some of the concepts we talked about today and talking a little bit more about not just data collection and analysis, but really the concept of moving into continuous quality improvement, which of course includes good data collection and analysis. Then June 26th, we'll be talking about the Community Action Poverty Simulation. Missouri Can is going to be presenting on that. So with that, I think we are up to the portion of the webinar where we'll take any questions. I'm going to check the question and answer box as well as the chat. I think, let's see. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions at this time. I do see a thank you that it was helpful, so we're glad that it was helpful. Just a reminder that the recording and slides will be posted to the resource library after the event within the next 2 business days or so. And if you have any trouble finding that, feel free to email me. My email is here on the screen, ckohler@communityactionpartnership.com, and I'll be happy to help you find it. Or we can get you kind of an advanced copy before it's posted. All right. Well, Barbara, anything else you want to say as we close out the webinar? I'm not seeing any questions.
Just a reminder that data analysis needs to become an integral part of agency functioning, and it's going to take some dedicated activities and effort to make that happen in agencies where it's not already a common practice. And I think to say it doesn't have to be difficult, it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It just has to be a way to help the information that you collect become useful in decision making. So just to encourage people to try, to look at their data, to think about what they see, and then we can go from there.
All right. Thank you. Good point. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and close it out, and we hope you all have a great day, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.